Thank you for joining us. We've got a question at the bottom of the screen for you to consider. Just something to think about as we wait for participants to join us. So the question is, how is trust in medicine or the medical community created, and how is it broken? Please consider this as we just give a few minutes for participants to join us. Thank you. Hello, welcome. And so everyone is aware this recording or this program is being recorded. So if you are not comfortable with your face being potentially on the screen, feel free to have your camera off. And we do ask that you keep your microphone on mute throughout the program, but you're welcome to enter any questions or comments into the chat. Thank you so much. I see we have a few people introducing themselves into the chat. Hello from Brazil, hi from Brooklyn, hi from Albuquerque and Baltimore. We're so happy to have you with us. And from New Jersey as well, thank you. I see we have a few people starting to respond to that opening question, so thank you. Hi from Memphis. Hello to everyone in Anthology. All right, well, let's go ahead and start with some introductions. I'm Beth Evans. I work in the education department at the National Portrait Gallery. I'm joined by my colleague, Leslie. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Leslie Walker, and I'm the Social Justice and Scholarly Programs Lead at the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
All right, so this program is going to last about an hour. It'll be a dialogue between Leslie and I as we compare objects from our respective museums and how those objects speak to social justice issues, both from US history and today. Today we'll be talking about medical racism, which is a topic that we could never fully cover. So please, we encourage you to use the chat, but also continue this dialogue after the program. We have live transcript available. If people are interested, you can manage that by clicking on the CC button that should be on your screen to manage either the live transcript, closed captionings, or to opt out if you would like. Although we're getting together today from different places, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. And we also recognize that since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's flaws as well as its strengths. And the National Portrait Gallery strives to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. And we're hoping to cover some of those issues today through this In Dialogue program, which is a monthly program that the National Portrait Gallery hosts with our colleagues across the Smithsonian every month. And this is our second program. And today we're talking about a few objects from the National Portrait Gallery and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So I mentioned that you're welcome to use the chat. Speaking of the chats, we're going to go over just a few norms of our program today. First, please have respect for others and their opinions. Please consider your own privacy and that of others. Think before you hit the send button. Be kind to each other and avoid inappropriate material. So if you've just joined us, welcome. And we're going to go ahead and get started now by thinking on this question. How can we use medical science to combat harmful ideas about race? We'll give you a few moments to consider this, since this is going to be the core question of what we're discussing today. Once you've considered, you're welcome to enter any thoughts into the chat. We're joined today by my colleague, Vanessa Jones, who's also in the education department at the National Portrait Gallery, who's assisting us by moderating our chat. We have a very large group. We're so thrilled to have all of you with us today, but we're not going to be able to get to everyone's comments, so I apologize for that, but Vanessa is going to help us out with that. So Vanessa, is there anything you would like to share so far in what's going on in the chat?
Hi there, everybody. Wow, well, there's a lot of conversation going on in the chat. Honestly, it's hard to keep track. You know, the most recent posting, let's see. Oh, hold on, sorry, they're just coming so quickly. So here's one. Trust in the medical community might be secured or broken by word of mouth, endorsement, community acceptance, scientific proof. Trust and consent, it has been mentioned several times. So lots of different ideas.
Thank you so much. We've covered a few questions, just things for you to mull over as we look at these objects from the Smithsonian collections. We're going to start with an object from the National Portrait Gallery. This portrait of Charles Richard Drew. Before we talk about it, I always like to give people about 30 seconds to look at the portrait. And this close looking helps us take in what we have in front of us. So I would encourage you just to look from top to bottom, side to side. Now that we've had a moment to look, and I recognize that was a very quick moment, the first question that I want you to consider is, what details do you see in this portrait? That's one of the tools that we use to help us read a portrait, same as reading a book, or details, clues that an artist has put into, in this case, the painting, to help us understand what we're looking at and understand a little bit about the life of this person. So once you have noticed the details, how do you think these details help to tell the story? Vanessa, do you want to help us out with anything that's been offered up in the chat?
Sure. Microscope, tubes of plasma slides, test tubes with blood. Someone's noticing the white jacket that he's wearing. There's research going on. And someone has recognized this person as Dr. Drew. Someone notices that his hands look gentle. And a comment on the eye contact that he's making and the slight smile on his lips.
This is wonderful. We're already picking up on more of these clues, things like facial expression and clothing and objects around a person that give us a fuller picture of what this person did. In this case, we see a lab coat, we see blood. Now the next thing to consider is, what do these details make you wonder? Is there anything that was left out or anything that you would like to know more about?
So someone wonders what he had to endure as a Black male doctor pioneer.
Mhm.
Whose blood is it? And someone is curious about how this portrait came to be, who commissioned it.
That is a great question. We're going to get to that because this portrait as an object, it has a fascinating history that very much plays into the idea of this object as a tool to help us understand social justice in the United States, or the social justice movements in the United States. So and then the question about whose blood is this? That I had never thought of that. That is a fascinating question. The work that Dr. Drew did as he researched blood, it was a very personal work to him. And I think the question about whose blood this is, it goes back to the idea that it was personal for the people that the work impacted as well. All right, so all these questions together, the see, think, and wonder, this is a looking strategy to help us dig deeper into a work of art. I wish that we could all be in the museum looking at this portrait. It's pretty big, and the details stand out even clearer if we could see it in person, but we can't. So let's talk about this portrait and the clues that Betsy Graves-Raynaud, the portrait artist, included in this. As a lot of you have noticed, she has these details to help us understand who he is. He's wearing a white lab coat. He's a medical professional. He's both a doctor and a scientist. He studied blood. We see these vials of blood. We see the microscope. He is in the act of doing some kind of research. It looks like he's got this very delicate hand that he's putting this glass under the microscope to experiment or to test something. That was something that he dedicated his life to. He is known as the father of the blood bank. In fact, his firstborn child was born around the time that he pioneered the technologies and the experiments for creating lasting blood banks and moving away from person-to-person blood transfusions. Anyway, he named his first daughter BB for the initials BB of blood bank, because this is something that he was so much a part of his life. And Betsy Graves-Raynaud tried to convey that through these details in this portrait. The portrait itself is based off of a photograph by a man named Robert Scurlock. And Robert Scurlock was part of a photography dynasty in Washington, D.C. The Scurlocks, the father Addison and a few of his children, had a studio that primarily portrayed and represented African-American subjects in Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. in the early 19th century, or excuse me, in the early 20th century was this vibrant community of scientists and philosophers and artists and musicians and all of these people who were advancing the culture and the thought of the United States. And so the Scurlocks basically were there in the heart of all of it. So it's not a coincidence that that Robert Scurlock photographed Charles Drew. And something that I love about photography is that it helps us to consider the choices on the part of the photographer and also the choices on the part of the sitter, the person in the photograph, because it's there's this interplay between how does the sitter, in this case Charles Drew, want to be represented, how does the photographer want them to be represented. So think about the choices that were made with this photograph on the left. What did Robert Scurlock do to portray Charles Drew? What did Charles Drew do to help sort of shift or create this image of himself? You can either just think about it or write your ideas in the chat. And of course, the third party, I guess, in this interplay is us. What do we interpret from it as well? So it's between the artist, the sitter, and us. So what is your take on these things? Vanessa, anything you want to share with us?
So several people have commented on his skin tone and the fact that the skin tone on his face appears lighter than his hands. And then a related question about his skin tone is, if he had had darker skin, what would his life have been? So as an African-American, but with a darker skin color. So someone, do you want to comment on that or should I keep going?
No, I mean, those are really, really interesting comments already. A lot of emphasis on the color of his skin. I'm not sure if maybe like the flash of the camera has altered the color on his face at all. He was born and raised in Washington, D.C. and lived in a very vibrant community of African Americans. But his race, the fact that he was Black, affected his entire life. When he decided to go to medical school, in fact, it was because of a pandemic that he decided to go to medical school. His sister died as a result of a sickness after having gotten the 1918 flu. And her death and Charles Drew's own an athletic injury he received prompted him to go into medicine. And it was very uncommon for an African-American, even a light-skinned African-American, to be easily admitted into a medical school. And so he was accepted to Harvard, but there were some contingencies that he was not comfortable with. So he decided to go to a medical school in Canada, where the reputation was that it was a lot easier for an African-American student there. And then, yeah, just on and on. We'll talk more about what he experienced, but the fact that he was light-skinned, I don't know how much that made things easier for him, but I can definitely, having done a lot of research about him, attest to the fact that as an African-American man, that he faced discrimination despite his obvious intelligence and capability and being at the forefront of his field. Any other observations about this photograph?
Well, people are noticing the differences between the two. A few people have commented that they find the painted portrait, more approachable, that the photograph, he looks more erect and more regal. Obviously, there's more details in the photograph. So the artist has simplified the details in the portrait. He looks powerful. One person commented how, important it is to have a portrait like this of a Black doctor because of the, historical distrust in the medical community.
Absolutely. The artist who painted the portrait on the right, she painted it after Charles Drew's death. And so she had every liberty to decide how she wanted to portray him and what, if she wanted to base the portrait off of a photograph or what. And so she selected this portrait of Robert Scurlock, I think, for a lot of the reasons that people have noted, that he's in action, that he looks very much like a doctor and a scientist. And it's that kind of representation is so important. Betsy Graves Renault was an American from the United States living in France. And when Hitler and the Nazis started taking over Europe, she was horrified, and she came back to the United States and was equally horrified to find that same kind of sort of master race pseudoscience and ideology was being projected onto African Americans. And so she started painting portraits of noteworthy African Americans, of people who were role models and examples of greatness in the United States. And she painted this portrait of Charles Drew as a visual rebuttal against racism. And his whole life was a rebuttal against racism. So I mentioned that he went to school in Canada, then he came back to the United States. He was a researcher at Howard. Then he went to Columbia and became the first postdoctoral graduate who was African American in Columbia. He then, because of his intense research in blood, when the Blood for Britain campaign started, he led the campaign, and it was through his breakthrough technologies and his discoveries that that scientists were able to separate and store blood the sort of the watery substance and then blood, plasma from blood. And that led to the ability to create blood banks and what they called blood mobiles, where blood would be transferred around. Millions of lives have been saved because of Charles Drew's work. But even as all of this blood was being worked on and studied and saved and sent to Britain and used for the soldiers fighting in World War II, there was still this policy in the military to segregate the blood of white donors and the blood of Black donors and the Black and white recipients of the blood. And he, as the pioneer, the head of his field in researching blood, he urged the military to stop segregating blood, that there was no reason to segregate it that way, that yes, of course you segregate it by blood type, but the segregation needs to end there. And they ignored him. And so he stepped down as the head of the medical department of the Red Cross. And he came back to Washington, DC, and continued to research blood. He started up a surgery program at Howard, at the Howard University Hospital. And he worked on championing African-American doctors and pursuing anti-racist policies through the education and the top tier training of these up and coming doctors. He went back to Howard around 1941, 1942, and within a few years, his first class of African-American surgeons were graduating and entering the field. So he died in a car crash in 1950 and died still at the height of his career. There's been some speculation about whether or not a blood transfusion, which he pioneered, would have saved his life. And that's been argued about a lot. It may or may not be true. A lot of people say that that wasn't true, but what is true is that he was a champion, not just for proper medical science and proper training, but also for anti-racist, anti-segregation policies throughout his work. So with all of that in mind, we're going to look at someone who was a contemporary of Charles Drew, whose objects are in the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
I just want to quickly say before we move on, yes, that just a lot of great conversation that people are having amongst themselves. But, you know, here you've just described how incredibly accomplished he was. And yet several people have commented that they never heard about him until college. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just like you mentioned earlier with somebody else's comment that this kind of representation is important, telling these stories is important too. So thank you for whoever noted that. I appreciate that. All right, and I'll turn the time now to Leslie to tell us a little bit about another pioneer.
Hello, everyone. So right now on the screen, there are a few objects, and these objects come from the museum, from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that I would like you all to take just a quick moment to look at. So can we guess what these objects are? And who might use them?
Leslie, do you want me to read these out, or are you?
Yes.
Okay. Calipers, I don't actually know what those are. Forceps, OBGYN tools, tooth extraction, measuring devices, skull calipers, if I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. Calipers. Who might use them? Doctor or anthropologist. Tools to measure head size, shape. Phrenologists like to use them.
So these are all really great answers. I just have one more question for you guys just to work with. And the last one is, how might these objects, how might they relate to our topic of medicine, race, and social justice?
Well, someone is commenting that unfortunately the Nazis like to use them to determine Aryan race. People use them to try to quantify race. It was believed that Black people had smaller heads. And that
Right.
Black people didn't feel pain.
So thank you all. These are all wonderful answers to the questions that I had put out to you all. So those of us that guessed that they were calipers, you are correct. So we have two examples of calipers, a sliding caliper and a scaling caliper. And calipers, they are measuring instruments that are used by quite a few different professions, but in this case, these are medical tools that are often used by doctors or scientists. And they're used to measure distance, but in a medical setting, they would be used to measure width and thickness of muscles or of the skeleton. And there's also a cloth bag as well. So this cloth bag is quite important because this is where you would put your tools at. And at the turn of the century, going into the 1900s, early doctors, they didn't necessarily have pockets in the way that we do now, and you wouldn't necessarily want to put your medical tools in your pocket. So you would have a sterilized cloth bag that you would tie to your belt, and you would slide your instruments into the pocket. And these tools were used by Dr. William Montague Cobb. And Dr. William Montague Cobb, he used these tools, these calipers, to measure parts of the human anatomy and specifically bones. So if we can go to the next slide. So Dr. Cobb, he was an African-American physician and biologist, he was more specifically a biological anthropologist. So as a physician, he was able to assess and treat medical diseases. And as a biological anthropologist, Dr. Cobb studied the anatomical and behavioral aspects of human beings. He specifically studied bones and how they move throughout the human body. So Dr. Cobb, like Dr. Charles Drew, he was raised in Washington, D.C., and he studied at Howard University. He received his undergrad degree there as well as his degree in medicine from Howard University. And he later, he later received his PhD in anthropology at Case Western Reserve University. And he was the first African-American to receive a degree in anthropology. So he was a doctor twice over. During his time at Howard, once he returned to Howard to work as a researcher and a professor, he became very interested in dispelling negative ideas about race and science. And it was in 1936 when Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals at the Olympics in Berlin, Germany. And during this time, Germany was under the occupation of the Nazis. And Hitler perpetuated this idea of Aryan supremacy. And when Owens, a Black man, won 4 gold medals, he challenged these ideas. So new ideas had to be cooked up. And the idea was that Owens was able to win these Olympic medals because of his African-American genes. And this argument stemmed from an even older idea that Black people were stronger and more athletic than whites at the cost of their decreased intelligence. And this idea was used to justify slavery, manual labor, as well as medical experimentation of African Americans. Dr. Cobb became very interested in this case. And when Jesse Owens returned to the United States, he contacted him and asked him if he would be involved in a medical study in which Dr. Cobb measured Owens' limbs. He also examined his musculature. But then he also looked at other athletes as well, African American and white, and compared their measurements of the most prominent athletes at the time. And he demonstrated that Black people, they weren't necessarily born with a unique athletic trait, and that a person's physiology, which made them superior in one sport, didn't necessarily mean that they would be really great in another sport. So if you were really good in football, didn't mean that you would be as equally superb in basketball. He demonstrated that it took hard work, it took training, and the incentive to win to increase academic performance. And this was seen both in African Americans and European Americans. Dr. Cobb, he collected defleshed cadavers that were either purchased or donated to Howard University. And he did this collecting between 1931 and 1965. And in studying these human skeletons, he was able to provide and build more evidence that concluded that African Americans did not have different skeletal or cranial capacities in comparison to white people. And that in fact, a skeleton of a white person and a Black person looked exactly the same, and you would not be able to tell the difference of the two skeletons unless you had knowledge beforehand. And in this photo, on the left, there's a sepia tone photo, and this is of Dr. Cobb as a young man. This is his graduation photo from Howard University. And on the right, you can see Dr. Cobb holding the calipers in his hand. And that is part of, and right next to him is part of a human skeleton that he would be examining.
Leslie, can I ask a question on behalf of someone in the chat?
Yes.
So someone would like to know if his work has contributed to the development of modern forensic anthropology.
Oh, certainly, yes, it has. So the skeletons that Dr. Cobb was able to collect over the course of his career, a subsequent portion of them are still archived at Howard University, and they're being studied by new generations of researchers at a lab that's named in his honor, and it's called the Cobb Research Laboratory. So can you go to the next slide? So this is a manuscript written by Dr. Cobb that was published by the NAACP, and it is titled The Medical Care and the Plight of the Negro. So the Negro is, the term Negro is a word that was of popular parlance at the time. However, we don't use that word today to refer to African Americans, but during this time, this would have been acceptable for Dr. Cobb. And in his research, Dr. Cobb, he discovered that skeletons of people that you couldn't tell the difference between who was a white person, who was a Black person, who was an Asian person. There was no real key distinctions. However, if the cadaver did come with some knowledge of who this individual was before they had passed away, and if they were cataloged as African American, what he did see, he saw was the physical impacts of racism in America and how that impacted the livelihoods of African Americans. And he published this book. What he saw is that African Americans who lived in the segregation era, they had lower life expectancies than white people. And he could see that through their bones. And this was due to African Americans suffering more ailments at the time compared to white people due to being denied access to well-maintained resources such as housing, hospitals, and schools. My final question, oh, Vanessa, you had something?
Yes, well, someone's asking what year is this publication?
So this publication, just give me a moment, I have it in my notes. And again, this manuscript was published alongside the NAACP, and it was published in 1955. So this last question that I have for the audience is just thinking back to this manuscript and the calipers from earlier, how might those objects have been very important and critical to the research of Dr. Cobb? So I see that some folks, I see in the chat that bone density, impacts of nutrition. There's a question that says, what is it about the skeleton that led Dr. Cobb to come to these conclusions? It was due to different stress markers on the bone, that he could see the stress and strain on the bones of folks that were previously identified before the skeletons were defleshed as African American. He could see in comparison that they had far more marks on their limbs, specifically in their legs and in their arms, compared to those who had been identified as white. I see he would have been able to dispel any myth about different races. I see one saying Dr. Cobb would have used scientific truth to dispel racist myths. You're exactly right. Another one, dispelling the ridiculous myths and racial bias, especially in sports. And I see quite a few more.
And Leslie, oh yes, sorry.
Just one more that I wanted to read off. He found that race did not necessarily correlate with athleticism. You're exactly right.
Yeah, and something that, a connection that I'm seeing between Dr. Drew and Dr. Cobb is the adherence to just like the strict science down to like the mathematical.
Anything that anybody has before we sign off for the weekend?
Let's make sure we're all on mute, please. But that when you strip away all of the like the external forces that racism has caused, you know, if you strip away all of the biases and white supremacy and, you know, generations of trauma and just look at like bones and blood, like that's what tells the real story. So I think that the facts of science disprove a lot of the pseudoscience.
Yes, I would agree, exactly right. There was a question that I saw earlier, and forgive me for paraphrasing, but I believe it was, how was his research, Dr. Cobb's research, received? So Dr. Cobb, he was very active in the community, in the African-American community. His manuscript, it was published alongside the NAACP, and he served as the president of the NAACP from 1976 to 1982. He was also a frequent contributor to the Journal of the National Medicine Association, Medical Association, that is, which is the largest association for African-American physicians. And he published several articles from 1944 until his death in 1990.
I'd like to share an interesting comment. It states that Dr. Cobb's findings are a great example of the fact that although race is a social construct, racism can have a scientifically observable effect in health outcomes.
Yes, I would certainly agree with that comment, that race most certainly is a racial construct. However, it does have real consequences, as Dr. Cobb was able to illustrate in the consequences, unfortunately, on the bodies of African Americans. You could see that they suffered greater illnesses that were easily treated, and that the story of their lives were very much written in their bones.
All right, let's move on. Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you for all of these fantastic comments and so much more for us to think about. Now, a question for all of you is, what additional connections do you see between these Smithsonian objects, between the portrait of Charles Drew, the painting that we looked at initially, and then these instruments that W. Montague Cobb used? What connections do you see between them, or what stories do you see unfolding from what we just talked about?
They're both leaders in their fields. Washington, D.C. is a common link, as is Howard University.
Yes, that's something that we had discussed, is the role of geography in this story, that Washington, D.C. Played such a pivotal role, not just Washington, D.C., but HBCUs, the historically Black colleges and universities. Howard in particular, I know we have a few Bisons in our midst. Howard University played a huge role in this. I don't think it's a coincidence that after butting heads with the scientists and the leaders in the military and the US government, with trying to get them to stop segregating blood, that it was costing lives to take the time and energy to segregate blood, that Dr. Drew left and went to Howard and started this whole class of students, training up African-American doctors who were gonna do more to push back against all of the racism that was so prevalent.
Yes, certainly. I would like to note that both Charles Drew and Dr. Cobb, they were born in the same year. They were born in 1904. They both attended Howard University, and Dr. Cobb received his medical training at Howard University. So this was during a time when very few African Americans were practicing medicine or admitted to medical schools at all. And Howard University at the time was one of the very few schools that was dedicated to educating a large and new class of African American doctors. In the chat, I do see references to Omega Psi Phi. Yes, both Dr. Cobb and Dr. Drew, they were members of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, which was founded at Howard University. And I think a lot of Howard University, I think both of them being Omega men, certainly helped propel their interest in medicine, but certainly using medicine in a way to help advance the human race, but also advance the positioning of African Americans and how people thought about them.
Talking about the how much Howard had a role in their work, I want to read a quote from Dr. Drew. He said, "So much of our energy, our meaning African-American doctors and scientists, so much of our energy is spent in overcoming the constricting environment in which we live, that little energy is left for creating new ideas or things. Whenever, however, one breaks out of this rather high-walled prison of the quote-unquote Negro problem by virtue of some worthwhile contribution, not only is he himself allowed more freedom, but part of the wall crumbles. And so it should be the aim of every student in science to knock down at least 1 or 2 bricks of that wall by virtue of his own accomplishment. So to me, that's such a powerful testament to how a school of fellow African-American doctors and scientists that don't have to fight against all of these racist ideas and racist rules and all of that, that they can just focus on the work, how much more they flourish in those kinds of environments. Vanessa, would you like to share any of the chat comments with us? I know we've been getting a lot.
Well, there's a comment here that connecting the instruments, so this is back to the question about the connections between the objects, connecting the instruments with Dr. Cobb's work versus the associations with pseudoscience about race shows that context matters as well. The way Dr. Dobb used instruments was in the interest of science that served to advance racial equality.
I would certainly agree with that. I think context plays a lot of positioning in the work of both men, but certainly Dr. Cobb recognized this immediately in the way that Jesse Owens was being treated in the conversation around him. As a physician, he understood and treated many people who had limited access to healthcare and medical facilities. And as a biological anthropologist, he knew that, there's something to this discussion about African Americans being more quote unquote, more athletic than other groups of people. What is that? And just a quote that I would like to share from Dr. Cobb is that, and it says, although the Negro has shared in the benefits of modern medical advances, he has never done so as fully or as rapidly as the rest of the population. And he brings up the rear of a backward region. So Dr. Cobb was very cognizant of this and dedicated a lot of his work to upending these ideas that were spouted as medicine, as science. He knew that this science was incorrect, it was faulty, it was used to position a particular agenda and an ideology. And he worked very hard to have folks reconsider that.
Beth, there's a quote that points to your comment that points to your quote that says, it reminds me of Toni Morrison's quote that racism is a distraction.
Exactly. I think Dr. Drew is getting at that same point, that when you don't have those same distractions and are able to focus, I mean, he talks about it as energy, real energy that it takes to fight back against racism, that how much can be accomplished when that energy is redirected. So thank you. And I think it's important to note also the contemporary, the legacy of the work of these doctors. I saw someone noted that this isn't African-American history, this is American history. And I would agree and say that considering how much has changed as a result of the work of these doctors, it's world history as well. And Dr. Drew noted that even while he was in the middle of his work in New York in the Blood for Britain program, as he was pioneering this blood separation technology, he knew that what he was doing was going to change the world. The National Institute of Health has the Charles R. Drew papers. I would encourage you all to, and Vanessa can give you the link to that. I would encourage you to go and look at these primary sources. It's full of letters that he wrote, and some of them were letters to his wife. He was a newlywed with a newborn daughter when he left for New York, and he wrote his wife pretty regularly to apologize for all that she had to do to maintain the home. But he noted that they were both aware of how important the work he was doing was, that he was not only paving the way for for future doctors, future scientists, but that he was changing science permanently. And he noted also that it was this drive that he had in that knowing, that knowledge that he was changing so much, that kept him working so hard, that he said that it was like there was this force compelling him to work and not to relax or have fun at all. And that's come to fruition. I mean, Leslie, I would love to hear your thoughts, you being an anthropologist as well, your thoughts on the global impact of Dr. Cobb's work.
I would say both Dr. Cobb and Dr. Drew. This month, February, is Black History Month. And during this month, we highlight and we remember the important people and events in history of the African diaspora. And this program here, we're highlighting the contributions that African Americans have had in the field of medicine. Dr. Cobb and Dr. Drew, they've had associations with Howard University, and Dr. Drew has a school, a medical school named after him. And when we were preparing for this program, Beth, we saw that Dr. Cobb has a center in Dr. Drew's school named for him as well too. These men, they had interacted with each other. We had discovered that they wrote to each other in great admiration. I wouldn't necessarily say that they were friends, but we knew that they went to the same school, the same alma mater, belonged to the same fraternity, they had the same values. And it makes sense, certainly, that they would speak highly of each other and encourage each other. Dr. Cobb, as I stated, at Howard University, he has a center of a portion of his original collections that are still being analyzed. The objects that we have in our collection at the African American Museum, they were donated by one Dr. Michael Blakey, who is a biological anthropologist teaching at William and Mary, who considers himself to be a descendant, intellectual descendant of Dr. Cobb. And he had these objects and donated them to the museum. It was associated at one point in time with the Cobbs Research Center. So Dr. Cobb and Dr. Drew have had lasting impact, not just on African Americans, but on the world, and training a new generations and more generations of doctors and biomedical researchers to this day.
Yeah, and on that note, one more plug for the Charles R. Drew papers. In a letter to his wife, Dr. Drew commented that he hoped that he was paving the way for his daughter to have an easier time studying medicine and being a doctor. And one of his children did go on to be a leading doctor in her field. So yeah, it was personal, and it had long-lasting effects. And I also, because I work at the Portrait Gallery, I just have to comment on these two portraits that we have right here in front of us, and the power of representation, that we have these two African-American doctors. And if we think back to the original photograph of Dr. Drew as well, we can add that to this mix of images of doctors at, in the middle of research or in the middle of changing the world, that how important it is to see this kind of representation. I think that there's something to be said for these being some of the lasting images of these two men, and how great it is to have these images as we talk about them. Vanessa, is there anything you want to wrap up in the chat before we sign off?
There hasn't been as much lately. There's a comment about that his nephew, the astronaut Frederick Drew Gregory, who was the first African-American shuttle pilot. I would like to, is this a good time for me to mention the program next month?
This is a wonderful time, yes.
Okay.
And also thank you for that note about his nephew. I had no idea. And yes, I see a comment about his daughter, Charlene Drew Jarvis. Yes, let's talk about her and what a phenomenal work that she did, and how her father I don't want to say he was a feminist because I don't want to place words in his mouth, but he absolutely taught his children, both his sons and his daughters, to be the best that they could be. All right, so Vanessa, now to you.
Sure. Well, thank you all for coming today. So if you'd like to come back, please do. Next month, March 11th, is our next In Dialogue program. And the Portrait Gallery will be collaborating with the National Air and Space Museum and the National Women's History Museum to explore how a pilot, an orator, and a community worker can help us understand the qualities of a great leader. And if you hold on just a second, I'm going to put the link in the chat. So if you want to, this is the Eventbrite link. Oops. If you want to register, there it is. You can do it right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you so much, Leslie. This has been really, really inspiring to me to hear about these doctors. And thank you all so much for all of your comments. I'm so glad that we have had all of your participation in this. I learned so much from this. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening. Oh, and there's our contact information as well. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Leslie.